They moved along the open plain that traced the valley's edge. Since the night Yelea had first spoken, a subtle change had settled into the relationship between the three of them. At first, Yuto had regarded Yelea's presence as nothing more than a mysterious phenomenon, a silent, drifting entity, a distortion in space, a presence without touch or substance, each beyond the reach of understanding. But as they walked together, sat together, and brushed against fragments of her words, he began to sense that Yelea was less an anomaly and more like a will that appeared from within nature itself. In the fragments of speech, the flickers of expression, and the texture of her silences, there was a wavering and uncertainty that no natural phenomenon could explain. It felt rather as though she were attempting to observe her own self.
Akina, on the other hand, regarded Yelea as a dangerous, unknown variable. Her training as an L.I.S. technician had taught her to treat any undefined existence as something to be eliminated. Outwardly, she maintained a composed facade, but somewhere deep inside, she could not suppress her disquiet as she watched Yelea change in ways that defied theory. That unease grew sharper once Yelea began to weave human-like words. It struck Akina that this presence was no longer merely recorded information, but a being that emerged from the web of relationships itself, and that realization shook the very foundation of her understanding. Between the two of them, Yelea slowly learned their words, attuning herself to the shifts in their expressions and the weight of their silences. To Yuto, she brought a sense of ease. To Akina, a tension that never quite faded. Yet her presence was no longer something to be treated as an object. It had begun to breathe between them as a relationship. Yelea's eyes wavered, like the surface of a lake catching the light of dawn. I wonder, does this world know I exist?
At the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley, Yuto and Yelea sat side by side. Behind them, an undulating sea of bamboo grass stretched into the distance, each blade catching and scattering the morning light. The cliff's rim was lined with bare rock, weathered and carved away by the wind. Far below, the valley lay veiled in mist, its depth cut deep into the land. Somewhere in that shrouded distance, the faint murmur of a river drifted upward on the breeze. The calls of birds were low, melting into the sound of the wind until they vanished entirely. Above, a handful of stars still lingered, while in the east the sky had just begun to flush with the pale rose of morning. The wind was gentle, yet the air carried a faint undercurrent of tension. From far away came the sound of birdsong, though even their voices seemed muted, as if dulled by an unseen haze. Yelea sat with her knees drawn up, her gaze fixed on the valley beyond. Her hair swayed softly in the breeze, catching the light in hues somewhere between silver and transparency. Her skin seemed at once to absorb the light and reflected with delicate precision, its contours wavering as though they might dissolve at any moment. She wore something that resembled clothing, yet it blended seamlessly with the wind and light, making it impossible to tell whether it was fabric or radiance. From her shoulders down her back spread a faintly translucent membrane like drifting mist, pulsing in quiet rhythm with her breath. "This view," she murmured, "isn't in my memories, and yet it feels nostalgic." Beside her, Yuto glanced over her profile. "Where you came from, did you ever have moments like this? Just sitting and looking out at the scenery?" He recalled the single phrase she had once shared about herself. "I am an observer of the stars." That lone sentence was all she had ever spoken of her origins. What did she mean by stars? Were they distant celestial bodies, or another form the Earth had once taken? Even Yuto couldn't say for certain. Yet, in Yelea's words, and in her silences, there lingered traces of a life shaped in an environment far beyond the limits of their own common sense. His question had been born of a desire to understand the difference between the place in her memory and the world they now shared. Yelea tilted her head slightly. There were landscapes among the stars, mountains, shapes of water, but never with someone's gaze laid upon them. Gaze? There was no presence that possessed the landscape. Seeing and being seen were separate. Here, someone sees and someone feels. That's why it's different. Yuto couldn't completely grasp her meaning, yet there was a faint heat in her voice, enough for him to sense, instinctively, that she was speaking of something deeply important. Yuto gave a small nod. A short distance away, Akina knelt over an open terminal of her recording device. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, yet there was a stiffness in her motions, and from time to time her gaze drifted toward Yuto and Yelea. In the eyes that fixed on the two sitting at the cliff's edge, there was a glint of wariness, confusion, and the faintest trace of impatience. To her, Yelea's figure appeared eerie, alien. That softly glowing outline refused to merge seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. If anything, it trembled ever so slightly, as though rejecting it. The parts that resembled skin never kept a constant form, and from time to time, thin lines of light pulsed through them from within, like a network of nerves, or perhaps some unknown structural lattice. And each time Yelea spoke, her voice carried with it a subtle dissonance that seemed to make the surrounding air vibrate. The edges of the sound were indistinct, intelligible as words, yet leaving behind a crawling sense of wrongness, as if the brain itself were warning that something was not quite right. That Yuto could hold a calm conversation with such a being at all struck Akina as nothing short of abnormal. More than anything, it was the fact that this being was trying to act like a human. To Akina, that was an imitation with unknown intent, a mimicry whose purpose she could not read, and therefore an unpredictable risk. Is this a phenomenon or a will? The thought lingered, yet she had no means to define it. Only her intuition spoke clearly. If she involved herself too deeply with this entity, the boundary lines that had upheld her world until now would surely shatter. Even as her work gloves grew damp with morning dew and the chill bit into her skin, Akina gripped her tools harder than necessary, moving slowly, as if verifying each step one by one. Behind her, the grass swayed in the wind, carrying with it a restless presence, a tension that made it feel as though merely being here was somehow out of place. It was not just work, but it was also her own way of keeping a safe distance. She held herself back, keeping reason from yielding to the instinct to intrude on the delicate atmosphere of the conversation.
"What do you mean?" Yuto asked. Yelea spoke while gazing into the wind. "I am an observer from the stars, but I never imagined that being observed could feel this painful. Everything is trying to define me. Painful? Each time I'm given a shape, I become less of who I am. But when I talk with you, the boundaries loosen. You don't try to pin me down. That's why it feels easier. Maybe that's because we're just talking, not recording. Just a conversation." Yelea lowered her eyes gently. "When I speak with you, I feel myself. I wonder if that's what it means." They left the cliff behind and descended slowly along the field path damp with morning dew. The sound of grass underfoot, the wet press of soil against their soles, the occasional chill of wind slipping past. Within the quiet, a faint tension lingered. The wind had changed, or so it seemed, the moment they reached the mouth of the valley. Yuto came to a halt. Nothing visible had altered, yet the air felt denser somehow. Glancing back, he saw Yelea closing the distance, as if she were made of drifting motes of light swaying in the breeze. Her outline shimmered faintly in the morning sun, wavering at the edges. Akina, unaware, kept walking ahead until a subtle shift in the air behind her made her furrow her brow. Something is ahead. For the first time, Yelea produced something close to a voice. It was too indistinct to be called speech, more like the lingering resonance of a tone reverberating deep within the brain. In that instant, the scenery blurred. The sky warped faintly. The leaves of the trees trembled without sound, and underfoot the ground did not quake, yet its texture changed. "The space is shaking." Akina turned sharply in surprise. At that moment, the L.I.S. device strapped to her waist emitted a sudden warning tone.
Approaching unrecordable zone. Observation interference detected. Partial disruption of recording functions. The place they stepped into carried an unseen dissonance, a distortion that could not be traced by the naked eye. The wind shifted abruptly, and a silence like the pressure of tinnitus filled the air. Then, one step over the boundary, and Akina's vision warped. She dropped to her knees.
"What is this? The terminal won't respond."
As her hand moved toward the device at her waist, several figures emerged quietly from behind. Their clothes stirred as if dissolving into the wind, yet not a single footstep was heard. Despite their noiseless presence, their movements showed no hesitation. It was an older woman who caught Akina's arm, while 3 men approached swiftly from either side. The 4 villagers stood in a loose ring around her. Their posture carried no open aggression, but it was laced with the wariness and distance reserved for something from outside. Their garments, coarse as hemp cloth, bore the muted colors of the natural world, faded grass, dry earth, without a trace of ornament. Beyond them stretched a backdrop of slender trees swaying in the wind, their trunks spaced just enough to let the damp, velvety green of moss carpet the ground. Through the gaps in the canopy, a dim, clouded light filtered down, painting the earth in a muted glow.
"Wait!" Yuto called out. At his voice, the villagers glanced at him, only for the briefest moment. They showed no sign of alarm toward him, merely letting their eyes drift away again. "One without a record, chosen by the stars, perhaps." The words came in a low murmur from an elderly woman. Her voice was rasped with age, yet it carried a weight that was unmistakable. She stood a step ahead of the others, her face etched with deep lines like stone weathered by decades of wind and rain. White hair streamed loosely in the breeze, and her hand rested firmly on a wooden staff. Her gaze was not on Akina, but fixed squarely upon Yelea. It was the look of one who sees through, without fear, without hostility. Only a quiet blend of certainty and reverence bled into her eyes.
Yuto and Yelea were permitted through. The settlement, hidden deep within the folds of the valley, lay cradled in the quiet embrace of the trees. The narrow path beneath their feet was a patchwork of moss-covered stone and damp earth, the roots of grass catching against the soles of their boots. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in mottled patterns, and the air carried a mingled scent of soil and leaves. The houses seemed almost sunken into the ground, their roofs overgrown with wild moss and grass. Weathered wood and earthen walls formed their exteriors, with no trace of sharp artificial lines or the gleam of metal. There was no electricity here, no screens, yet the air itself felt alive. Somewhere nearby, the murmur of running water whispered. Farther off, the faint beat of bird wings echoed. The wind slipped past their ankles and along their skin as though it bore words of its own, while the leaves above swayed in a quiet, unhurried rhythm. Akina had been placed in isolation inside a small hut, the villagers casting wary glances at the device she carried. From it seemed to seep the scent of recording, a presence that, in this land, was instinctively rejected as an alien intrusion. A place where the wind of records does not pass. Here, to behold is to wound. The village pelder spoke from her place on the northern side of the square, where a slight rise gave her a view over all present. At her feet, a set of time-worn wooden steps led down, and as she descended one deliberate step, her voice unfurled into the air.
Yelea stood in stillness beside the stonework at the center of the square. Her form was clear to the eyes of every villager present, yet not a single one dared to approach. At the southern edge of the square, Yuto kept his place, a hollow stretch of space lying between them. He hesitated to take even half a step forward, yet his gaze never once wavered from her. From the shadow of one of the houses ringing the square, Akina watched in silence. The villagers had gathered at the thresholds of their homes, perhaps a dozen or so encircling the square. The elders stood wordless, the younger ones frozen mid-task with tools or firewood still in their hands. Children peeked out from behind the adults' legs,
their eyes the only part of them daring to emerge. The air was clear, yet strung taut. A breeze slipped in between the trees, brushing faintly against the grass of the square, while even the bird song seemed to have retreated into the distance. Do not observe, do not touch, do not remember. That is how one survives here.
Yelea stood within the open space at the village's center, a rough-hewn square where the grass had been cut short and the earth packed firm under countless steps. Around it, simple wooden houses were arranged in a loose circle. At the very center lay a ring of stones, the remains of what might once have been a hearth. Just to the side of it, she stood. Her outline wavered softly, never fully fixed, blending with the drift of wind and light around her, yet at the same time resisting it, exuding a faint but undeniable presence. Pollen and dust in the air eddied nepiously near her form, caught in slow, spiraling currents. At her feet, not a single blade of grass grew, as though the very earth avoided contact, holding its silence. The villagers watched her from the thresholds and edges of their homes. The elders stood with arms folded, the young froze in place with tools still clutched in their hands, and the children peered out from behind their mothers' silhouettes, showing only their eyes. Yelea, if she noticed their stares at all, gave no sign. She was looking only at the sky. Then, once again, she spoke, something shaped like words. I am the voice of the stars, but I want a will of my own. The elder drew in a sharp breath.
Those words, once another spoke them. Another? In the far-off fragments of record, I sense a ripple much like the will of your father. His footsteps touched this place. Yuto's heart lurched. Heat welled in his throat, and his vision sank into a wavering blur. My father was here? The question was less certainty than prayer, an unspoken wish, long pressed down in the depths of his chest, slipping into words before he could stop it. His eyes wavered, and his lips trembled faintly. This land once received his will, not directly, through something else, something that existed outside the record, carried his thoughts here.
Yelea turned her head in silence. The motion was smooth, almost lost in the wind, and each time the tips of her hair sliced the air, motes of light drifted upward. In her eyes shimmered a faint glow like starlight, with a depth that felt like gazing into the still surface of a deep lake. Those eyes did not merely look, they traced memories, observing the very fabric of the world itself. I am an observer, but sometimes that act of observation draws in the traces of a will. That which is unrecorded can, paradoxically, remain the most vividly. Just as you looked at me without defining me, so too did he try to touch the world.
Dusk. Akina was released, moving slowly, as if testing each step beneath her feet. The path from the hut to the square was utterly still. Yet the villagers, keeping their distance, watched her every movement. Her face bore a mixture of fatigue, confusion, and the faintest hint of relief. The evening chill bit into her skin like fine needles. When her eyes found Yuto, her expression softened for just an instant. Yuto stood rooted at the southern edge of the square. A short distance ahead of him, near the ring of stones, Yelea stood in silence. Akina's gaze moved between the two, back and forth, before finally settling on Yuto, and her steps came to a halt. "Hey, what were you two talking about just now? I'd been recording that one's vital signs and thought patterns the whole time, but none of the logs will read properly. Body temperature, brain waves, every record has turned into noise. That being is an undefined error. It doesn't even exist as a coherent information." Yelea listened intently to her words. Akina closed her eyes once, as if to keep her emotions in check, yet her voice still trembled as she went on. "I want to know what you are, where you came from, and why you're here. But you have no beginning and no end I can see. Even when I try to understand, you slip through me like mist. To be this close and still grasp nothing, how am I supposed to believe that?" In the stillness, Yelea slowly parted her lips. "The definition is inside you, but it will never reach me. That is why I cannot change you. Whether that's something sad or not, I still don't know." Akina looked away. Night's color fell across her profile. "I'm still afraid. Leaving something as unknown, just letting it be." Yuto spoke quietly. "But even if you don't understand, you can still feel. That's why it's not belief, it's resonance." That night, the sky shuddered. For an instant, the stars seemed to waver, as though their orbits had been knocked askew. As if sensing it, Yelea slowly rose to her feet. By the campfire, Yuto and Akina lifted their heads in unison, drawn by her movement. The stars shifted, the same as before. Her voice was low, melting into the wind, yet it carried a distinct tremor. The faint outline of her body caught the light, softly shimmering, as if the fire's red and the moon's silver were blending across her form. Her entire being was wrapped in a pale radiance. What's coming can't be stopped by observation alone.
Top Secret Report. Lower Layer. Observation Zone 7. Records concerning Milena Valley. Within the northwestern sector of the lower layer lies one of several unregistered settlements, located in what is designated the 7th Uncharted Observation Zone. Its internal designation, Milena Valley. Confirmed population, approximately 60 individuals. All identified members are without recording devices. No evidence of data link or communication history with the L.I.S. has been detected. Their educational systems and living culture exhibit a high degree of self-sustaining independence. There is no confirmed record of active contact with the outside world, and there are signs that any encounters with lost persons within the zone have been deliberately kept off record. The most distinctive trait is the educational evolution of their powers of observation. From early childhood, they are trained to sharpen all 5 senses, learning to read the subtlest changes in the natural world, the sound of the wind, the drift of clouds, the faint traces of an animal's passing. Through this, they demonstrate an exceptional capacity for anticipating danger without the aid of visual or recording devices. It is not seeing 1 and knowing 10, but seeing 1 and envisioning 100. Their judgments begin not with sight, but with bodily sensation and intuition. This is a form of intelligence rooted in the accumulation of lived experience, standing in stark contrast to the data-complemented reasoning of urban knowledge. In encounters with the unknown, they choose first silence and observation. Linguistic exchange is kept to a bare minimum. Their primary mode of engagement is an unresponsive response expressed through facial expressions and movements. Yet, when they deem it necessary, they act without hesitation to take physical measures, and the criteria for such decisions are, to any outsider, profoundly opaque. In the village, there is also the edge of observation, the unease and hesitation that come when confronted with the unknown. Among some of the younger members, an intellectual impulse toward the outside world can no longer be restrained. They are entering a stage of moving from observation to imagination. Yet, this does not reject the village's creed. It is rather the natural extension of an instinct to learn without fear of nature. One figure, believed to be of elder standing, Nagi, is said to have remarked, "Living while carrying contradictions is also a form of harmony with nature." In refusing to forbid longing for the outside while maintaining the village as a place to return to, their stance stands apart from the exclusionary ethics of established territories. This settlement is a blank space in the record, a place that compels the redefinition of both thought and existence. It is ruled neither by domination nor by submission, yet is filled with a quiet certainty. To truly step inside its essence is impossible through mere recording. Resonance, and resonance alone, is the key that will open the gates of this domain.